Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New York Historical Society. I'm Louise Mirror, New York Historical's president and CEO, and I am thrilled to see so many of you this afternoon in our beautiful Robert H. Smith Auditorium. This afternoon's History with David M. Rubenstein program features a conversation between Mr. Rubenstein and Jeffrey Toobin around the topic of Mr. Toobin's new book on the kidnapping of Patty Hearst and her subsequent trial, which shocked the media, the public, and the legal community during the 1970s. Now then, we are thrilled to welcome David M. Rubenstein back to the New York Historical Society as moderator of this evening's program. Mr. Rubenstein is the co-founder and co-CEO of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest private equity firms. Along with his illustrious professional career, Mr. Rubenstein has been an extraordinary patriotic philanthropist, making life-altering gifts to a number of the nation's most revered organizations and historic sites. For example, the Kennedy Center, which he chairs, the National Zoo, Monticello, Montpelier, the Washington Monument, the National Archives, and most recently, the new National Museum of American History. We're also delighted to welcome Jeffrey Toobin back to the New York Historical Society. Mr. Toobin is a staff writer at The New Yorker and is the senior legal analyst at CNN. He is the best-selling author of several books, including The Run of His Life, which was made into the critically acclaimed FX series American Crime Story, The People versus O.J. Simpson. His latest book is American Heiress, The Wild Saga of the Kidnapping, Crimes, and Trial of Patty Hearst. And now, please welcome David Rubenstein and Jeffrey Toobin to our stage.
It's hard for people to remember that it was actually 1974 when the Patty Hearst trial and episode came to our attention. What propelled you to want to go back and write a book about this?
Well, since it's the political season, I will begin by not answering your question and say thank you to you for all you have done to support the cultural heritage of our country. I was just at the National Book Festival. It is really, it's an honor to be with you. And since we're talking about the cultural heritage of the country, that brings me to the subject of the Symbionese Liberation Army. I wrote a story for The New Yorker about 3 years ago about a jail in Baltimore that was taken over by a gang called the Black Guerrilla Family. And I got interested in the history of the Black Guerrilla Family, which was then a prison gang, but was earlier. It was founded in the early 1970s by a then famous prisoner named George Jackson at Soledad Prison. And I got interested in the history of that period where prisons were seen by members of the counterculture, particularly in California, as hotbeds of political revolution. And I learned that the Symbionese Liberation Army also came out of the same milieu, the same sort of counterculture prison alliance. And I was having lunch with my editor at Doubleday, Bill Thomas, and he said, well, what about Patty Hearst as a subject? And I said, oh, come on, there must be 1 million books about Patty Hearst. And he said, well, go check. And I found, to my surprise and delight, frankly, that no journalist had looked at this story in more than 30 years. Okay. It was really, almost virgin territory journalistically, so I decided to dive in.
All right. And how long did it take you to do the research and write the book?
This book came together in a way faster than I expected because, I've written 7 books, and all of the other books have been as the result of stories that I covered in real time, so that the reporting for the book, in many respects, had already been done. Here, I was alive in the 70s, but I was just a kid, and I had basically no knowledge of the underlying facts. So I was starting pretty much from scratch. It was the first book that was really at the borderline of journalism and history. But to answer your question, probably a little more than 2 years.
Okay, and you point out in your book that you had a treasure trove of materials that came to your possession. How did you get these materials?
Well, this was really the turning point in my research, and my first concern in deciding to write a book about events that took place in 1974, 5, 6, was who was still alive. And it was almost exactly 40 years later that I started writing the book. And one of the things I was pleased by was the fact that most people who were involved are still alive. Not everyone. And one of the people who was still alive was a guy named Bill Harris. Now, as I'm sure we'll discuss, there was the Symbionese Liberation Army was not Symbionese, because there's no such thing. It's a made-up word out of symbiosis. They didn't liberate anyone or anything, and as an army, they had at most a dozen people. Right. 6 of whom were killed in the process. So Bill and Emily Harris are 2 of the only survivors. And Bill, after he served the 2 prison terms, worked as a private investigator, and actually quite a good one. And he's a pack rat, and he made it sort of his mission to assemble all the documents in connection with the SLA, all of the trials of the various members, and he had 150 boxes of material. And when I met him, he had just had a deal to sell it to a university library that fell through, and I bought it instead at a discount.
Discount? But now you're going to donate it to?
Yes. In fact, Amy and I, my wife and I, just this weekend, we were pulling them all together. I mean, she and I are both now very happy to get these the hell out of our house and live. And I am giving them to Harvard Law School, and they will be bringing a truck to our house in Connecticut, I hope soon, to take them away.
All right, let's go back to 1974. So first, tell us who the Hearst family is. William Randolph Hearst and his 5 sons.
Well, let me ask the audience a question first. How many people here have heard of something called a newspaper? Because, they really were big for a long time. And in the 1970s, they were still big. And there was no greater name in newspapers, in terms of newspaper ownership, than Hearst. Because Patricia's grandfather, William Randolph Hearst, who died in 1951, 3 years before Patricia was born, was the most celebrated / notorious newspaper publisher in history. He created the grandest private residence in the United States, San Simeon in California. His life was the basis of perhaps the greatest American movie ever made, Citizen Kane. And still, in the 1970s, his name, which went to the Hearst Corporation, was still an enormously resonant and powerful name. He had 4 sons, each a bigger alcoholic and ne'er-do-well than the next. And his will specified that the Hearst family could never control more than 5 of the 13 seats on the board because he knew the talents or lack thereof of his sons. And so the company was always professionally managed. And to this day, when most media companies have failed to thrive, remains a privately held, very successful company not managed by the Hearst family.
Patty Hearst's father was Randolph
Randy Hearst, yes.
And was he active in the business, or what did he really do?
His title was publisher of the San Francisco Examiner. He was not actually the publisher of the San Francisco Examiner in the sense of a person who goes to work 5 days a week. And I mean, he was a very earnest, very open-minded, and interesting. I'm pleased to say that the screenwriters who wrote the O.J. Simpson miniseries are working on a feature film based on my book. And, one of the first things they said to me was, God, I wish your book had some more likable figures in it. But we all love Randy Hearst, because Randy Hearst, yes, the great loves of his life were duck hunting and red wine, but he was sort of an open-minded, friendly man, and desperately concerned about his daughter, who was his sort of special favorite of his five daughters. And her kidnapping led him to explore worlds that were very unfamiliar to him.
Although the corporation did very well, he had what I would call old money. Old money is often not that much money, right? So he didn't really have that much money, right?
Well, and that was another thing that that William Randolph Hearst made sure about with his kids, is that they had tremendous assets. I mean, they still owned at that point San Simeon. And they were technically the owners of the Hearst Corporation, but in fact, they had very little liquidity, and this became significant when, after the kidnapping, the kidnappers started to make some unconventional financial demands.
So let's go to the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was not symbiotic, wasn't a liberation, and didn't liberate anybody. It wasn't an army. Who were the people?
There was a prison near Berkeley called Vacaville, and at Vacaville prison there were a lot of students who went to tutor the prisoners and basically do kind of clandestine political organizing. One of the prisoners at San Simeon, no prison. I'd be happy to be a prisoner at San Simeon. No, it was one of the prisoners at Vacaville was a man named Donald DeFries, who was basically a professional criminal, but who, under the influence of mostly these women visitors to the prison, started to become political. He was transferred to Soledad prison, and in March of 1973, he escaped from Soledad, and he went to the only place he knew he would get a warm welcome, which was Berkeley. And he took up with many of these students and ex-students who had been, the tutors. And the Symbionese Liberation Army, to the extent people remember them at all, they are often thought of as like one of these black revolutionary groups, like the Black Panthers. There never was more than a single black person in the SLA.
He was the only one.
Donald DeFries. And as he began cultivating this sort of Afrocentric view, calling himself Symbionese, which was a corruption of the word symbiosis, people working together, he changed his name to General Field Marshal Sin-Q. And they all had code names, and the dozen or so people who gravitated around him were what ultimately became the Symbionese Liberation Army.
And most of the people who gravitated around him were women, not men.
Exactly. Right? And they were almost exclusively middle class. Virtually all of them had been high school cheerleaders. They were educated. Some of them were Berkeley graduates. Most of them had spent at least some time at Berkeley, which is obviously a very serious school. And the others were, people who had, a political consciousness that was warped by connection to this guy.
So a ragtag group of people who call themselves an army, but they really wanted to get in the news, do something, so they decided to kill somebody.
Well, that's the first thing they did. And there are kind of two stages of the SLA activity. In the first stage, so DeFries is an escaped prisoner from Soledad. So he can't really circulate much. So he's in this apartment in Berkeley, and he starts to fixate on a political figure in the Berkeley area, Marcus Foster, who is the school superintendent in Oakland, and really a heroic figure, someone who was trying to, very poor city, improve the education system, but DeFries, for his own bizarre reasons, becomes convinced that Foster is a sellout, is someone who is betraying.
He's African-American.
Also African-American, important point. And on, I hope I get the date right, November 3rd, I think, November 15th of 1973, Donald DeFries, Patricia Mizmoon Soltysik, and Nancy Ling Perry, two of the women recruits, they ambush Donald DeFries and his deputy outside a school board meeting, and they execute him in cold blood. and they send a communique taking credit to media outlets saying, we're the Symbionese Liberation Army, and we executed him because he was a sellout.
Now, some of the people involved in that, weren't they not caught?
Yes, and this is sort of where the precipitating factors for the kidnapping come in. Immediately after the assassination of Marcus Foster, there are 3 new recruits to the SLA, and they come from the Indiana University Theater Program, which, you wouldn't necessarily think as a hotbed of revolutionary activity, but it was because this was the time of guerrilla theater. This was the time when a lot of people in the theater world were thinking that theater could be a means of political activity. Another member of the theater program in that time was the actor Kevin Kline. Jane Pauley was also a friend of these people in Indiana. I assure you, neither one were members of the SLA. But when the SLA, when Bill and Emily Harris and Angela Atwood, the 3 from Indiana, joined in, they said to DeFries and the others, maybe we shouldn't do an assassination again, but maybe we should do something that makes a different kind of splash. Why don't we try a kidnapping? And right when they were making that pitch to DeFries, 2 of the original members of the SLA were arrested, and they had the gun, one of the guns that was used to free DeFries, and these 2 guys, Joe Ramiro, the names are not important, but the 2 guys who were arrested in connection with the murder of Marcus Foster, that sets in motion the kidnapping.
Right, so they think they should do a kidnapping, and they happen to be reading the papers, and they see that Patty Hearst is engaged, and they just pick her name out of the papers that way?
Well, they were weighing different candidates. I mean, they were originally thinking of sort of corporate chieftains. And one of the great / terrible things about the SLA is they were inveterate note takers and writers of things. So all their papers are still around. And you see they made these long lists of CEOs, Charlie Finley, who owned the Oakland A's, and I mean they had lots of names. But then
no private equity people, I hope.
No private equity, not at all.
Not important enough.
They knew you were on their side,
right,
so David.
Right.
January, I believe it was like January 13th. The San Francisco Examiner runs an engagement announcement for Patricia Hearst and her boyfriend Stephen Weed. Stephen Weed, and in the 4th paragraph, it says that Patricia Hearst is an undergraduate at University of California at Berkeley. Emily Harris, one of the SLA members, is working as a secretary at Berkeley at the time. She knows that in that more innocent time, there was a card catalog, a directory of all the undergraduates at Berkeley open to the public. So Bill Harris goes to the card catalog and looks up Patty Hearst and sees she lives at 2603 Benvenue, apartment number 4, which is a very nice but nothing extraordinary student apartment, a lot easier to get to than where any of the corporate chieftains that they were considering live. So they start staking it out, and they decide to kidnap her.
All right, so they organize it. They go ahead and proceed with the kidnapping. They go in, they break in, and then what happens?
Well, the 3 kidnappers are Donald DeFries, the leader, Bill Harris, and Angela Atwood, one of the who had just been in a production of Hedda Gabler in a community theater in Berkeley, and the 3 of them go in there and Angela knocks on the door and says, "Oh, I think I may have knocked into your car," and Stephen Weed opens the door wider, and the 3 of them burst in. Bill Harris hits Stephen Weed on the head, Stephen Weed says, take what you want, and he bolts out the back door.
Take anything you want, I'm out of here.
I'm out of here.
Very courageous.
Yeah. DeFreeze says to Patty, where is your safe? Because he apparently thinks rich people keep their money in safes.
Switzerland.
Yeah, that's right. That doesn't, there's no safe. And they basically gather her up and sort of wrestle her into the trunk of the car they have just stolen in downtown Berkeley, and they take off.
So she's in the trunk, and they take her to the apartment. They're all living in one apartment, more or less. They get her in there, and they put her in a closet.
Correct.
And what does she do when she's in the closet?
That's not funny. Who's laughing at that?
How big is the closet? It wasn't a typical closet.
No, well, it wasn't a typical closet. It wasn't much typical about this story at all. This was, I do think, as I'm sure we'll get to, I am fairly critical of Patricia Hearst as the story evolves. But I think it's important not to underestimate just how terrifying.
She's 19 at the time.
She's 19 years old. She's shoved in the trunk of a car. It's quite clear to her, because she can hear them talking, that these are the people who just killed Marcus Foster. It is, and she knows she's being kidnapped because of who she is. I mean, she can tell that they're, using her last name. And, it was then and remains to this day the only political kidnapping in all of American history. Think about it. I mean, there have been lots of kidnappings, but always for money. This was a political act, and it was terrifying. So, and they have prepared a walk-in closet with a mattress on the floor, and they have devised a lock so that it's locked from the inside. I mean, from the outside, so she can't get out.
Okay, they put her in there, and then basically they start the process of explaining what they are about.
Right, and what makes this story so bizarre and extraordinary is what happens next. Is they start talking to her. They start opening the door and explaining who they are. And they say, it is characteristic of how bungling and crazy the SLA was that they kidnapped Patricia without a clear idea of what the ransom demands would be. You would think that would be something you would think of first, right, before you kidnap someone. So initially they thought, well, okay, we want to trade her for our two comrades who were arrested, Little and Romero. Ronald Reagan is governor at the time. Even the SLA realizes that Ronald Reagan is not going to free two accused murderers. So what they do instead is they say, I know, we want to show the world what our real priorities are. And we are going to demand of Randy Hearst that he feed the poor of California. And they make financial demands on him.
So they initially asked for millions of dollars to be spent. He doesn't have millions of dollars.
Right.
He puts up $500,000, which is a lot for him, he says. And they start feeding the poor.
And they create this organization in like a matter of days called People in Need, and they rent this vast warehouse right next to where the San Francisco Giants ballpark is today. And they start giving away food. But it's a chaotic situation. Some of the food distributions turn into riots. And Randy Hearst accurately says to the kidnappers, look, I don't have millions and millions of dollars. He winds up putting up about $2 million, but, which is a lot of money in 1974. It's a lot of money today. And, but the SLA gets unhappy with Hearst's performance, and they start telling Patricia that your father is nickel and diming us.
And does she begin to say, well, actually, I don't really like my father and mother that much anyway?
Not exactly. What happens is there are 3 SLA members who are assigned as Patricia's keepers. And it's Nancy Ling Perry, Angela Atwood, the actress, and Willie Wolfe. Willie Wolfe is only one of the 3 male kidnappers. And he is the one closest in age and social class to Patricia. He's the son of a successful physician from New Milford, Connecticut. He is a prep school kid. He goes to Berkeley to study archaeology. And he's smart, and he starts talking to Patricia and listening to Patricia. And the 2 of them develop a relationship.
And sexual relationship also.
Right. And you know, one of the things in the story that I try to be very careful about is you know, it's like I guess it should be obvious, like what happened and what's remarkable is the degree to which Patricia's account of what happened and the SLA's account, the survivor's account, is identical, except in one profound way. Patricia claims that she was sexually assaulted in the closet, once by Donald DeFreeze and later by Willie Wolfe. The SLA members acknowledge all their wrongdoing in the kidnapping, but they insist that they would never have sexually assaulted her, and it didn't happen, and any relationship that she had with Willie Wolfe, which later becomes very important, was entirely consensual on Patricia's part. And that is something I lay out in the book that I just assert that, you know, there are irreconcilable conflicts on that issue.
Ultimately, she begins to turn and says, you know, I could be part of you, the Symbionese Liberation Army. How long does that take? A month?
Not long. Not long. She's kidnapped on February 4th. They send a series of communiques. You probably have heard some of them. They're usually on audio tape. The first one very famously begins, "Mom, Dad, I'm okay." And later, as you hear her voice becoming stronger, she starts to appear more sympathetic to the SLA. And on March 31st, so about 7 weeks after her kidnapping, she sends a communique that says, another famous phrase, "I have decided to stay and fight." And she, too, is taking a nom de guerre. And on that tape, she says, "I have taken the name of Tania," which I'm sure many of you remember. You may not know that Tania was the name, the nom de guerre of Che Guevara's partner and love interest who died by his side in Bolivia. So the name had a revolutionary resonance as well.
And then a picture is taken of her that became very famous with her with a machine gun. Is that right?
How much do I love this picture? I love this picture so much. And if you want to know about the picture, you can read my book. But I'll tell you some. You know, one of the great is that this is right before the bank robbery, and I say in the book, not facetiously, that this photograph is like the Mona Lisa of the 1970s. Because if you look, don't laugh, it's true. If you look at the expression on Patricia's face, it is so inscrutable. You can read into her expression fear, pride, delight, horror. It was a tiny little camera. It was just one shot taken by Ms. Moon-Soltysik, but it happens to be, and the photograph served as a kind of perfect metaphor for the whole story, because, that's why people are still interested in this story all these years later, because it's a mystery. What side was she really on? And the photograph is kind of at the perfect midpoint. It doesn't tell you.
Right. So after the photograph is taken, they plot to rob a bank. And the reason is the same reason Willie Sutton robbed banks, right? They needed money. They were out of money.
They were out of money. And but this is still a period where they are, you're right, they're looking for money, but they're also looking to make a political statement. So when Bill and Emily Harris are casing banks, deciding which bank to rob, they are looking for one thing in particular. They are looking for a relatively new innovation in bank security, a security camera. And they are looking for one that does have a camera.
Because they want everybody to see that she's part of this.
That's right. And so when they go in to the bank on April 15th, And they assign, there are 9 bank robbers. When they assign Patricia where she's supposed to stand, they put her right where they know she's going to be photographed by the security camera. And the photograph of her and the machine gun in the bank is almost as famous as the photograph of her in the beret.
So they rob the bank. They take a modest amount of money, relatively speaking. Was it
$11,000.
So they get the money, which for them is actually a fair amount of money at the time.
Yeah.
And then the FBI gets involved in trying to solve that, as well as the kidnapping. Is the FBI making any progress on anything?
Well, one of the great subplots, I think, of this whole story is the staggering incompetence of the FBI. It's 1974. It's 2 years after the death of J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI still consists of, several thousand white guys with crew cuts and black Oxford shoes.
Right.
They do not infiltrate well into the counterculture. They do not really have a very good way of, and so, they are at sea. And the other point that's actually, I suppose, somewhat in their defense is after the murder of Marcus Foster, an act so irrational, the Black Panthers denounced it, the Weather Underground denounced it, the SLA was completely isolated. So any routes in to the counterculture generally led to dead ends. And the FBI was involved from the day of the kidnapping, from February, but they made no progress.
So they didn't make a lot of progress, but the general got nervous about being in San Francisco. He says, let's go to Los Angeles.
Correct.
And how do they get to Los Angeles? They get on an airplane? Or
No, they have 3 cars. And Sin-Q says, I want 3 people in each car. They're actually 3 vans. And he divides them up, as it turns out, incredibly fatefully. But he divides them up so that there is sort of a balance of interests and skills in each car. And in one car, Bill and Emily Harris and Patricia Hearst, and they drive in a caravan from from San Francisco to Los Angeles.
So they get to Los Angeles, they rent the place?
They rent a place.
And then they decide they need some other things to do. And at one point, they decide they were going to go ahead and get some supplies. And Patty Hearst goes with 2 of the people to get some supplies at Mel's Sporting Goods. What happened?
Correct. Okay. Well, this to me is the turning point of the whole story. May 16th. So it is almost exactly a month after the bank robbery. The 9 of them are in this little house. And they start to go stir crazy. So Bill and Emily say, we need to go shopping. Let's go shopping. And so Bill and Emily and Patricia...
Rodeo Drive or someplace
not
else?
so much Rodeo Drive. They go to a grocery store. They go to a newsstand. And then they go, as you say, to Mel's Sporting Goods because you're going to buy some clothes. And here it becomes very important what happens. Bill and Emily go inside to go shopping. Patricia is left alone in the van with the car in the ignition. Now, you might ask, why doesn't she leave?
That's the first time she's really alone?
The first time she's alone, and she is by herself. She could walk away. She could drive away. She could call the police, call a doctor, call home, but she doesn't. She waits across 4 lanes of traffic from Bill and Emily. Bill and Emily go in, and Bill, because he's a genius, decides to shoplift. And he's stuffing stuff in his pockets and whatnot. And one of the clerks, Anthony Shepard, is an aspiring police officer. And he knows that the crime of shoplifting does not take place until the perpetrator physically leaves the premises. So he watches Bill but doesn't do anything. But when Bill gets out on the sidewalk, Anthony Shepard jumps on him. Emily jumps on top of Shepard. There's a melee. The bystanders jump. I mean, there's like people are fighting on the... Patricia is across the street and she sees what happens.
What does she do with her little machine gun?
Does she run away? Does she call the police? No. She goes into the back of the van, takes a machine gun, points it out the window, and sprays Mel's Sporting Goods with a full magazine of bullets in order to free Bill and Emily. Doesn't work. So she gets another machine gun and does the same thing. This time it works. And Bill and Emily Harris finally escape, and they get in to the van, and they take off. And now Emily Harris, several years earlier, has had a summer job. And Bill, and they realize, the three of them, needless to say, the machine gun has generated a lot of attention on the street.
Right.
So they thought they should not go back to the safe house. They decided to go where where Emily had a summer job, which was Disneyland. And they go to a motel in Disneyland where they turn on the television.
Okay, and he also, they kidnapped somebody as well.
Oh,
didn't
right, yes. Well, I didn't know how much we were there. Yes, this is perhaps my favorite character in the whole story. In order to, they know that everybody's looking for the van. So they basically, they're driving off in Inglewood, which is sort of a poor area of California, and they see a for sale sign in a window of a car. They go in the door, and this guy, Tom Matthews, comes out, and they says, well, can we take a test drive of your car? And Tom Matthews gets into the car. He says, okay, but I have to come with you. He gets in the car with the four of them, and Bill Harris takes out his gun and says, we're taking your van. And Tom, honest to God, says, well, that's fine as long as I'm back tomorrow for my high school baseball game. I love Tom Matthews so much. I interviewed him. He's now a real estate agent in Kansas, and he's just as chill as he was
but
then.
They actually got him back in time for the baseball game, right?
Well, they drove around. They were supposed to meet up with their comrades in the event of emergency at a drive-in theater. And so they go to this drive-in theater and they watch the New Centurions, and Bill Harris cheers every time a cop is shot in the thing. And Tom he and Patricia are sort of hitting it off, and Tom, that's right, and Bill, Anthony Shepard has slapped half of a handcuff on Bill,
right.
So they have to go to a hardware store to buy a hacksaw. And Tom helps him get the rest. And they wind up stealing another car where they give Tom his car back, and he makes it back for the game, which they win 1-0.
While they're in a Disneyland hotel, their colleagues realize that Mel's Sporting Goods has gotten a lot of attention, the shooting, so they decide to get out of the house that they're in, the safe house, and to look for another place. They find another place. How do they find another place?
Well, Bill, when he took the van, the three of them, to Mel's Sporting Goods, in the van was a parking ticket that they had got in front of the safe house.
Right.
So the cops knew where the safe house was. So
because they saw the address on the parking ticket.
They saw the address on the parking ticket.
They go to the safe house.
But DeFreeze and the other five, at that point, DeFreeze, Willie Wolf, and four women, realize that they need to move. And so they basically just drive around South Central L.A.
And look for a place to stay?
And look for a place where they can basically barge in the middle of the night. And they find essentially this flop house on 54th Street where people are up drinking late. And they basically say, can we give you a few $100 to stay here? And the people, they say, oh, yeah, sure. And so the six of them come in carrying machine guns and ammunition.
Right. And they weren't shy about who they were, right?
No, they weren't. And as a result of finding the first safe house, the next day the LAPD finds the house on 54th Street and surrounds
it, and then basically they say, come on out, or we're going to shoot, and what happens?
Well, they get a loudspeaker, and they say, surrender, come out with your hands up. And the SLA, the six people inside, respond with gunfire. And what follows on May 17th, 1974, is to this day still the biggest gun battle in the history of the United States. 5,000 rounds of ammunition go into this house. 3,000 rounds of ammunition come out. Ultimately, the tear gas that goes inside explodes. and the house burns down, and all 6 of the SLA members, Donald DeFreeze, Willie Wolfe, Patricia Soltysik, Camilla Hall, Nancy Ling Perry, they're all killed.
They're all done. Not one policeman was hurt. Is that right?
Not one policeman is hurt. I have to say, one of the most amazing reporting experiences I've had is one of the police officers was sort of trapped underneath the cement barrier in front of the house, and all the gunfire went over him from both sides. And I found him, and he took me to the site of where, now the house, of course, is gone because it was demolished, but he sort of walked me through where all the shooting went on, and it was just a miracle he wasn't killed.
So Patty Hearst and the 2 people she's with, they realize it's really hot now, so they decide to go back to San Francisco?
They go to San Francisco. Think about just how horrific this situation is. The other point to be made about the shootout on May 17th is that the television minicam has just been invented. All live television before 1974 approximately had to have cable laid and baseball games, political conventions. But because of the invention of the minicam, live broadcasts of breaking news events could start. So this shootout was broadcast around the country. And the SLA goes to, the 3 survivors, Bill and Emily Harris and Patricia, they go to San Francisco to try to find someone who will help them out.
Well, there are only 3 members of the SLA left, one of whom is Patty Hearst.
Right.
So they go to San Francisco, they find some soulmates, they kind of move in with them, and then why do they decide to go east?
Well, one of the people who sort of adopts them is this really, I think, kind of fascinating figure from the 70s named Jack Scott. Jack Scott was first well known as what's today called a sports activist. He was someone he was an athlete, and he saw that college athletes were treated terribly. They were they'd lose their scholarships if they were hurt. They were given all sorts of dangerous drugs to keep them on the field, and he became a figure in that world. He was later named briefly the athletic director at Oberlin. He was a journalist later, but he's one of these guys, like a lot of people, and I don't say this as criticism, he wanted to do good, but he also wanted to do well. And so he thought, well, I think I could get a great book out of these SLA people. And so he says, but I need to get them the hell out of here and get them somewhere safe where they're not going to be killed and continue killing people.
Right. So they ultimately, he, with his mother and father, drive these people all the way to the East Coast, New York.
Right. Think about one of the great road trips of all time. Jack Scott calls his parents, who are retired in Las Vegas, and says, Mom and Dad, you think you could meet me here in Berkeley? I'd like you to get involved in this project with me. And Bill and John and Lydia Scott, they get this big car, and they drive east now. But John and Lydia are peace-loving people, and John and Lydia, they say to Patricia over and over again from the beginning, "Are you sure you want us to do this? Why don't you just let us go home? Let you go home and stop all this nonsense." And right before they get on the 510 to start heading east, John Scott pulls over to the side of the road and turns around and says to Patricia, "Patty, look, one last chance. Do you really want to go through with this? Why don't we just take you home?" And Patty Hearst looks at John Scott and says, "Just drive the fucking car, or you'll be dead too." She was badass, I'm telling you, man. So
they drive the car,
drive
they come
across
east.
But they drive east. And the first place they go, I assume some of you are West Siders. The first place they go, before they go to this farm that Jack has rented, they go to Jack's apartment at 317 West 90th Street.
Anybody live there?
And Amy and I just made a pilgrimage there recently, and It's still pretty shabby, although the 2 townhouses down is now for sale for $18 million, which was not true in 1974. The even weirder part of all this is I was 13 years old at the time. I lived on that block with my parents, and that address came out shortly after
You don't recall seeing
Patricia
them.
was arrested. And I remember talking with my mom and dad. Did you see her? I didn't see her. No, we didn't see her.
So they go there for a while. Then they go upstate
Then they
for a
go
while.
to this farm near Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And they basically sit down and try to write a book.
And nothing really comes of it.
Yeah,
and
it doesn't work. Those of us who have written books, it's actually kind of hard to write a book. And it's not the most surprising thing in the world that these lunatics could not figure out how to write a book.
But ultimately, Jack Scott thinks maybe it's not so safe for you to be here, and this is so wonderful, so they decide to go back west.
Right. And here is where I think they keep gravitating towards the Bay Area because that's the only place that they know. And sort of Jack washes his hands of them. And there's a family that is taking care that the way they get to Jack Scott is a woman named Kathy Solia gives a speech in defense of the SLA, and Emily Harris approaches her. And basically what happens is when they go back, they are adopted by the Solia family. Kathy Solia, Steve Solia, and...
When they go back to...
And they go to Sacramento.
Right. They go back, in other words, when they leave the East, they go back to Sacramento, adopted, in fact, by the Solias, right?
Right.
Okay.
And here it's not disputed, Patty Hearst and Steve Solia fall in love. I mean, there is a clear consensual relationship that goes on there, and they go to Sacramento, which is sort of close to the Bay Area, but they feel at a safer move. And again, they run out of money.
So they go back to their favorite trick of robbing a bank. But this time, something fatal happened.
Right. Well, they robbed 2 banks. The first, and this time, they're looking for banks without security cameras because they are like, we just want to get some money. And I mean, they are really, leading a very hand-to-mouth existence. They rob a bank, the Guild Savings Bank. They only get about $3,000, but it's relatively successful. Then on May 17th, 1975, now here it's a year later. I mean, they have been on the run for a year. May 17th, 1975, they rob the Crocker Bank in Carmichael, California, which is a suburb right next to Sacramento, and something goes terribly wrong. Emily Harris, there's a woman, they rob the bank right at 9 o'clock, and just as they come inside, there is a woman named Myrna Opsal who is delivering for deposit the church offerings from her Seventh-day Adventist church. And she's carrying an adding machine, and she puts the adding machine down, and Emily Harris's shotgun goes off and kills Myrna Opsal. Emily, they rob the bank of about $10,000, and Patty drives the getaway car. And they go to their hideout in Sacramento, but things...
And ultimately, they're in their hideout, and then they're starting to work for a living. They start to do some painting and other things.
That's right. And not surprisingly, they're starting to get on each other's nerves, as you can imagine it might, after going through all this. And they sort of split. Bill and Emily go in one direction, and Steve and Patricia, along with this woman who is kind of joins the group named Wendy Yoshimura, go in a different direction. But Steve Solia basically starts painting houses for a living.
That's what he does.
That's what he does.
Patty Hearst is helping him paint sometimes.
Patty Hearst sometimes goes and helps him paint. And ultimately, on September 15th, 1975, a year and a half plus after the kidnapping, the FBI, through the painting business, actually identifies Bill, Emily, Patricia, and Steve, and all 4 of them are arrested where they're living in San Francisco at that point.
And Patty Hearst is arrested.
Right.
And does she shoot at the time? Does she just go?
She doesn't. I mean, she doesn't have a gun. I mean, she has a gun in the house, but the FBI bursts in, and she doesn't have a chance to get it. But she is, she's taken to the police station.
What does she say she is?
Well, the first thing she does is, the photographer, she gives this sort of revolutionary salute, and then she's booked, and she's asked her occupation, as people are when they are arrested, and she says urban guerrilla, which was accurate.
Right.
I mean, that was her occupation at that point. I mean, I should add that during this period in San Francisco, they start setting off bombs, mostly unsuccessfully, thank goodness. But this is in keeping with the revolutionary moment. I mean, there were 1,000 political bombings a year in the 1970s. Think about that. Think what Fox News would do with that today.
But today, when she's arrested, all of a sudden she is meeting with her parents again.
Right.
And does she revert to her old self?
Not right away. She at first she has this lawyer who's kind of from the counterculture who agrees to pass letters between her and Steve Solia. And I was able to get a hold of these letters. And the letters are about how, that Patty writes from jail, we are going to continue leading the revolution. We are going to overthrow the government in America, Amerikka. But in very short order, she starts to realize this whole revolutionary thing is not working out.
So her family
well.
ultimately hires F. Lee Bailey,
Right.
the most famous lawyer in the country at the time, and what does he do as a defense?
Bailey immediately cuts off contact between Patricia and her revolutionary comrades, and the family starts spending time with her. And, I have to say, like most prison visits, these were all tape recorded, and so I have all the tape recordings, and I listened to a lot of them. They loved their daughter. I mean, and I mean that in a completely uncynical way, that Randy Hearst was there, and her mother, who was a much more conservative, harder-edged person, much more contentious relationship with her daughter. Her friend Trish Toobin was there, and Trish said, well, it's good to see you, but I'm leaving to go skiing for 4 months in Switzerland. This was not the kind of people she was around.
But she get out on bail?
She does not get out on bail.
So they go ahead and have a trial, and the jury trial.
Right.
And does the jury take a long time to decide?
Well, Bailey makes, just about the trial, there is one key moment in the trial where he decides to put Patricia on the witness stand. But what he doesn't nail down is what the scope of cross-examination will be. Because Bailey wants her to testify about being kidnapped and being incarcerated and being forced to rob the bank. The defense is coercion. But the prosecutor gets up and says, well, I want to cross-examine about the shootout at Mel Sporting Goods, the bombs, the other bank robberies, and the judge allows it. So Patricia is forced to take the fifth in front of the jury.
No, not in front of the jury.
Yeah, it is in front of the jury.
Oh, I thought it was before the pre-trial.
It was first. No, it's in front of the jury. 42 times in front of the jury. And the jury is like, they don't like it when you take the fifth in front of the jury. I mean, it's very unusual, and she gets convicted, and she's sentenced to 7 years.
Convicted in just 1 day.
1 day, yeah.
So the judge dies before the sentencing.
Right.
Another judge comes in, and he sentenced her to what?
7 years.
7 years, and she's already served some time.
Right.
But then she decides she needs something else.
Right.
And
your old boss, Jimmy Carter.
My old boss was asked for a commutation.
A commutation. And the Hearst family mobilizes an extraordinary amount of support for across the political spectrum. Ronald Reagan supports a commutation, and a critical event has happened right before Jimmy Carter has to make up this decision. The Reverend Jim Jones takes 900 of his followers to Guyana, and as I'm sure many of you remember, they commit mass suicide. So the question in front of the American people at that moment is, how can someone act so much against their self-interest? And that question leads Carter to be more sympathetic to Hearst, and he grants a commutation after she serves 22 months.
Your book points out that my former boss said how come he was cut out of the involvement of the Stuart Eisenstadt, was asked how come he wasn't in...
Because he was against the idea of a commutation. Yes.
That's probably true. And anyway, he was told by Carter's lawyer, just stay out of it. Carter does the commutation, and then she's freed, but then she later wants a pardon.
Right.
Did she get a pardon?
She sure did.
Who did that?
Bill Clinton, on the last day of his presidency.
Oh, I didn't know he pardoned anybody on the last day.
No, it's interesting. That's why a lot of people don't know.
Right.
It's because the Mark Rich pardon and the Roger Clinton pardon got so much attention. But also on that last day, Patty Hearst became the only person in modern American history to receive a commutation from one president and a pardon from another. And when you think about the scope of her crimes and the bad stuff that she did, that to me is the purest example of wealth and power in America.
So here is the final question. After doing all this research, you wrote the book, do you think that she was justly imprisoned, or do you think she was, quote, brainwashed, as they described it?
I think she was justly imprisoned. I mean, now, one of the things about writing a book this long after the fact, I don't have any sort of agenda. I didn't know much about this case when I started. So, I didn't write this book to, nail Patty Hearst. I had no preconceived notions. But when you look at the amount of time she was on her own and the opportunity she had to leave, she and Steve Stolia, they would go hiking. Once they got stuck on a cliff and they had to be rescued by the state police. So they gave fake names so they wouldn't, be caught. I mean, she joined the SLA. I don't know how much time she should have served in prison, but I do feel it was an outrage that she got so much special treatment.
Did she cooperate with your book?
Not so much, no.
And where is she now?
Where is she now? Well, and many people may remember she married her bodyguard, Bernie Shaw. Unfortunately, sadly, he died of cancer in 2013. She lives still in New York suburbs. Bernie was the head of security at the Hearst Corporation.
What happened to Stephen Weed?
Stephen
Did she ever see him again?
Stephen Weed. Well, just to finish the thought on Patty, the amazing thing about Patty, when you think about it, is she led the life for which she was destined. She became a rich lady in the suburbs.
You end the book by saying she became
her mother.
Because she's raising dogs or breeding
dogs.
dogs.
She shows dogs, and
she won recently.
She won it, yes. And if you buy the book, you can see Rocket the Shih Tzu, who won the
best toy dog.
You probably don't even have to buy the book to see that, but the toy dog. But Stephen Weed, who was a philosophy graduate student when they were living together, did not become a philosopher. He became a real estate broker in Palo Alto. But the thing that is so profound in many respects about the story is that, we are who we are. And Patricia, the whole thing turned into the junior year abroad from hell.
Right.
But
she was.
All right. She was Patty Hearst.
Thank you very much. Great
Thank
story.
you, Dave.